The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's New Report webinar series. This webinar series features presentations by senior Army leaders responsible for key programs and initiatives. It also features contemporary military authors who weave together the past, present, and future story of the United States Army. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Retired Guy Swan.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Noon Report. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our great nation. Joining us today to discuss his new book is Dr. Seth Jones. His book is entitled Three Dangerous Men, Russia, China, Iran, and the Rise of Irregular Warfare. Also joining us today to moderate the conversation is Major General John Ferrari, United States Army retired. General Ferrari is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the chief financial officer at Complex, a data analytics and cybersecurity firm. General Ferrari served for 32 years in the U.S. Army and had numerous high-profile assignments, including Commanding General for White Sands Missile Range, the Deputy Commander for Programs at the NATO Training Mission in Afghanistan, and the Director of Program Analysis and Evaluation on the Army staff. General Ferrari is a West Point graduate with a degree in computer science and an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. For those joining us online today, please take advantage of having Dr. Jones and General Ferrari here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. And after the discussion, we'll take as many questions as time will allow. You can also find the full bios for Dr. Jones and General Ferrari at the Handouts tab. With that, I'll turn the floor over to General Ferrari, who'll tell us a little bit more about our guest.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here with Dr. Jones today. He's a Senior Vice President and the Harold Brown Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he's also the Director of International Security Program and the Director of the Transnational Threats Projects. He also teaches at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced and International Studies and at the Naval Postgraduate School. Prior to that, he worked at the RAND Corporation, where he did defense policy and international studies. He's the author of numerous books and articles focusing on counterterrorism, irregular warfare, and covert action. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, General Swan and General Ferrari, and I look forward to the discussion and the question and answer session. Let me begin by providing a bit of an anecdote on what the whole purpose of this book and the focus of the subject of irregular warfare is. The British soldier and military theorist B.H. Littlehart tells a story of a walk in the English countryside between the Irish statesman John Wilson Croker and the first Duke of Wellington. And as they're walking through the countryside, Croker expresses extraordinary respect for how much Wellington is able to tell him what is happening on the other side of every hill. The nooks and crannies, the streams, the different kinds of foliage. And Wellington says, well, I have spent my entire life trying to guess what was at the other side of the hill. And then Wellington continues to expand on that comment by extending it into a definition of an important component of generalship in the wider sense of trying to guess what is happening at the other side of the hill, in the opposing front and the opposing mind of the adversary. And so that's really the focus here when it comes to irregular warfare in this book, is to focus on what the U.S.'s main adversaries. In this case, I'm focusing on the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians. We could certainly talk about other countries, including the North Koreans. but how are they thinking about it? Not so much how are we thinking about it, but how are they thinking about it, and how can we then respond? So why is this important? U.S. defense strategy, including with a soon to be released national defense strategy, is focused on competition with major powers, including the Chinese and the Russians at the top. And it's a long overdue shift. We certainly spent a number of important years focused on terrorist groups that targeted the United States on 9/11 and plotted attacks afterwards. But I do think there is a danger of thinking only about the conventional and the nuclear side of these adversaries. We certainly need to prepare for, conduct war games of, develop operational plans or OPLANs to deal with Russian invasion of NATO, including of the Baltic states, certainly Ukraine, also a Chinese invasion of the Taiwan Straits, which will lead to air-sea battle, but also an important Army and Marine Corps component. But as I'll argue, there is an additional dimension to this that is below the threshold of conventional and certainly nuclear war. And it's in the arena of what U.S. military doctrine calls irregular warfare, although some have called various aspects of the gray zone or asymmetric conflict or political warfare. And I mean those terms generally synonymously with what I'm calling irregular warfare. These are, this is a way that countries, including the U.S., can use to weaken adversaries and increase their balance of power in their favor. All of these instruments, as I use them here, are occurring below the threshold of conventional or regular warfare. That is, that they don't involve set piece forces on battlefields or in the maritime domain. They include several components. One of them is information campaigns, information operations. That could include various aspects of public diplomacy, psychological warfare, disinformation or misinformation. An important component also of support to state and non-state partners. In addition, the use of intelligence as well as special operations forces in the conduct of covert action. And then finally, economic coercion. I'll give examples of these, particularly in this case with the Chinese and Russians, although we may want to expand that into other U.S. adversaries in the question and answer and the discussion session. And I think why this is important is the role of nuclear weapons, particularly among the great powers, has historically been a bit of a caution. If we can all collectively remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when both Moscow and Washington came close to nuclear war, both thought very carefully about that. The U.S. put a blockade as the Soviets put in nuclear weapons into Cuba. And I think both sides backed away from conventional war and certainly nuclear war, in part because the costs and risks were so high, both in terms of the economic costs of what that kind of warfare would imply, and also the cost and the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals if nuclear weapons were to target cities. So in addition to just tactical nuclear weapons, targeting cities. So what we saw during the latter years of the Cold War was intense fighting between the Soviet Union and the United States, but actually in the third world, in Latin America, in Africa, generally not directly. That's the kind of aspect that I'm talking about here. So what's additionally important to understand as we talk about the other side of the hill is to understand how our adversaries think about this. Now, if we talk about the Russians, for example, they use different types of terms. Active measures, for example. During the Cold War, it was the KGB, Service A, that was in charge of active measures. Now we have organizations, particularly the GRU, Russia's main intelligence directorate within the Ministry of Defense, as well as the SVR, Russia's foreign intelligence agency, as well as some aspects of Russia's domestic intelligence agency, the FSB. The Russians have also been heavily involved in denial and deception. These are important parts on the irregular side. The Iranians have used terms like soft war, jung-i-narm, to describe aspects of competition below the threshold of conventional war. And then with the Chinese, it is important components like the three warfares, which include various aspects of, first, public relations or media warfare, second, psychological operations, and third, lawfare, none of which involve actually kinetic operations. So what's interesting is these are aspects of warfare that look a little bit less like a pure Clausewitzian sense of warfare in the sense of using violence, at least in all cases, and in some cases a little bit more like Sun Tzu's achieving objectives without resorting to fighting. So there's an important component we'll see of Sun Tzu and how the Chinese continue to view competition and warfare. The individuals in the book that I focus on, and the idea here is to spend pretty significant time understanding key influential leaders as we understand how adversaries think. A lot of this involved significant time, energy, and actually money in translating materials from Russian, Mandarin, and Persian into English. I think it's an important part of understanding our adversaries in reading what they have written, and actually in reading the types of works that have inspired them. What do they read to influence how they think about warfare? On the far left is Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the Army Staff, certainly one of Russia's most influential military thinkers. In the middle is General Zhang Yuzhou, who is the Vice Chairman of China's CMC, the most powerful and important Chinese military body, and one of China's few PLA officers with actual combat experience in at least two Sino-Vietnamese wars. And then third is the now deceased Qasem Soleimani, and actually his predecessor, Ismail Khani, who I looked at, important particularly as the Iranians used irregular warfare from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force. Let's start with the Russians. I'll talk about the Chinese, and we'll leave the Iranians to the discussion period. When we look at Gerasimov, one of the things that I've been most impressed about Gerasimov is how much he and some Russian leaders studied U.S. operations in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan and Iraq, in Libya. They looked at the color revolutions, didn't always come, I think, to accurate conclusions, but studied very closely what they called their main enemy, the United States. And one of the things that they looked at was how the U.S. was able, with a focus on limited maneuver elements on the ground, the heavy use of air power to overthrow a number of governments. So they looked at the U.S. support to the KLA and the use of air power in Kosovo. They looked at similar aspects in 2001 of the overthrow of the Taliban regime. They certainly looked at a much bigger American presence in overthrowing the Saddam regime in Iraq, but 2011 was a light U.S. footprint on the ground, heavy use of air power to overthrow the Gaddafi regime, and a significant focus on leveraging Libyan militia and sub-state actors. So as we saw, the Russians move through Crimea and then into Syria. We saw various aspects of this play out. They took Crimea and annexed it essentially without firing a shot, with a heavy use of Spetsnaz and disinformation campaigns. They started the war in 2014 largely by supporting Russian irregular units. They provided a little bit of direct involvement of conventional units, but it was heavy indirect and irregular involvement in supporting Russian private military companies and Russian-backed irregular forces. And then in Syria, a little bit of an upgrade in many ways, much more significant use of Russian air power and naval power, for example, Caliber cruise missile strikes, but the maneuver element was largely irregular in the sense that it was the Russians and the Iranians leveraged, trained, advised, equipped Lebanese Hezbollah to help retake major cities like Aleppo, militias that were recruited from the Hashd al-Shabi or the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestinian militias, which were key elements. So the Russians did not get involved in a major way, at least in the ground force component, putting Russian regular units in Syria. And they did reasonably well starting in 2015 and retaking most of that territory by 22 with at least a light Russian footprint. We also saw them in Ukraine use a heavy focus on offensive cyber operations, particularly NotPetya, which had a broader global dimension, but again became an important component of irregular operations. I'm going to leave the discussion actually of Ukraine to the Q&A, but let me just say, useful example here of irregular warfare in the sense that the U.S. president made it clear in the early stages of the Ukrainian war that the U.S. was not going to become directly involved, at least under his presidency, in a war with the Russians directly in Ukraine. So what that has meant in practice is that it is providing assistance to a partner to fight the Russians indirectly. This is sort of the quintessential aspect of how the U.S. fought the Soviets in the Cold War in Latin America, Africa, and other places. It was indirectly through state and non-state partners. In addition, we've also seen the Russians target the U.S. homeland, either directly through the SVR, the GRU, or through non-state hacker organizations, including with a Colonial Pipeline attack by Russian hackers, which for several days in 2021 shut down the gas, the availability of gas and oil in the eastern seaboard of the U.S. An interesting aspect there of targeting a major critical infrastructure. We've also seen a major increase in Russian deployment of private military companies overseas. Again, not a big Russian conventional presence in these areas, but Wagner Group and others operating jointly with the GRU and the SVR and with the Kremlin, the heavy focus, including in Latin America, of Russian irregular units, in this case also private military companies. Let me shift briefly to the Chinese, and then I'll summarize some of the main points. On the Chinese side, I mean, this is the country that has given us some of the most quintessential texts of irregular operations: Mao's On Guerrilla Warfare and Protracted Warfare, Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And we've seen it also move into the cultural sphere. So if we look at Wolf Warrior 2, now the second most popular movie in terms of viewership in the history of China, it includes a couple of things of interest for this audience. First, it takes place not in the South China Sea, not in Taiwan, but in Africa. Second, its main enemy is the United States, who the Chinese fight. Third, interestingly, the Chinese hero is a former special operator operating against U.S. private military companies in Africa. And the ending line to this movie gives us a sense of where the Chinese are going. The U.S., you are the past, he says, looking over a dying American whose name is Big Daddy in the final throes of the movie. We are the future. And I think that is the line we see with the Chinese. And again, the argument here is not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about the increase in Chinese conventional capabilities, Army, Navy, Air Force. We certainly should. And we certainly should deter the Chinese at the conventional and the nuclear level and be prepared to fight if we have to move to either conventional or nuclear war. What I'm arguing instead is there is an additional dimension to Chinese competition that is important to analyze. And if we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it is a nearly global effort here. I'm not even including Latin America, of what on the surface appears to be economic and infrastructure construction. So we see with the various maritime Silk Road areas in blue, and in orange here, the Silk Road economic belts, mostly by land, the Chinese have been investing in road, port construction, bases in these areas. In reality, there is an important part of influence here that pulls us up to political and even military influence. First, there's the building of bases, so an increase in power projection that has come with the Belt and Road Initiative in Gwadar, Pakistan, in Djibouti, now on the west coast of Africa. Chinese have been interested in the United Arab Emirates as well, in building port capacity, in building the areas where they can fly in aircraft, including military aircraft. So there's an important military dimension to that. In addition, we have seen the Chinese use the economic leverage to pressure, influence countries to support the Chinese on issues that matter to them, either internally within their country or at international organizations like the World Bank, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. Issues like the adjudication of major trade disputes, the status of Hong Kong, pressure against Tibet or the Xinjiang province. So Chinese leverage, economic leverage, has been used for significant political, even subversive aspects. And there's a third dimension of this, which is the 5G. It's the Huawei component. We can certainly look at 6G areas where the Chinese have also used this economic infrastructure for intelligence collection on various signals platforms. We've seen the Chinese take territory. This is the rough version of what the Russians did in Crimea. This is the Russians taking what were atolls or reefs in the South China Sea, in this case by sand dredgers overnight. And as one can see, that what the Chinese did under the auspices of providing islands so that fishermen in the South China Sea could use for refit or resupply, these are now legitimate Chinese military bases. These have signals intelligence platforms, missile batteries, electronic warfare. These are runways where the Chinese can land aircraft, including strike aircraft, strategic bombers in some cases. These are military bases now, seized through what I would call irregular means. Lots of espionage that have been used to increase China's competitiveness overseas. Look at a close analysis of the F-35 and the J-31. Chinese stole important parts of that to build their fifth generation technology. I do think it's important that we consider aspects of sabotage and subversion as we look at Chinese efforts in the long term in Taiwan, not just a straight up conventional invasion. And let me just conclude before turning this over to General Ferrari by highlighting, I think, some of the main conclusions. First is that I consider competition with U.S. adversaries to be global in nature, not just in the European sphere or in the Indo-Pacific. And at the root of it, I think, this is a map from Freedom House that tells us about democracy across the world. What we've seen, according to Freedom House estimates, is 16 straight years of a decline in democracies across the globe. And what I'm getting at here is a future not just of military competition, nuclear, conventional, and irregular, between the U.S., the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians, but also competition over political, economic, and other systems. And that really is at the heart of what, in my view, competition is like. And so what it means is the U.S. and its Western allies and partners are democratic. We support freedom to choose who our leadership can be. We support freedom of the press. We support capitalism. We support freedom of religion. And we face adversaries that do the opposite in all of those categories. They do not support democracy. They have Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are essentially leaders for life, at least as long as they can stay strong. They do not support freedom of the press. They are very focused on disinformation and controlling information to their populations and globally. So the broader point is that we have to recognize that there is an important irregular component to this competition below the threshold of conventional nuclear war, in addition to that conventional and nuclear competition. And with that, I will turn this over to General Ferrari for a bit more of a substantive discussion.
Thank you very much. So you started off the conversation with looking at the other side of the hill. And so you peered on the other side of the hill and you found countries, enemies, that view the world as not peace and at war, but continuously at war. So looking back from our side of the hill, what are the implications for the United States?
Well, I think one of the most important implications for the United States, as I see it, is that we need to be focused much more on understanding what is going on the other side of the hill. And let me give two examples of this. One is during the Cold War, the United States spent significant time, resources, money in speaking Russian, building individuals with Russian expertise. We spent significant time educating our population about what was happening on the other side of the hill. We had a well-resourced U.S. information agency. In the State Department, we had a foreign broadcast information service that translated large amounts of information from newspapers, from radio programs, from books, and from television in the Soviet Union, in Poland, in East Germany, and in other areas of the Warsaw Pact, translated that into English and made it publicly available. We are not there with the Chinese. Unless you speak Mandarin, it's almost like it's a no foreign component. We have very limited access to a lot of Chinese documents that are written in Mandarin. There is no publicly available open source enterprise. We have no equivalent of the Foreign Broadcast Information Service or even the U.S. Information Agency. I know we have a Global Engagement Center at State, but it is heavily under-resourced. So, I mean, across the board, what I would say is we have a long way to go in really understanding our adversaries, particularly the Chinese. And I mean that within the U.S. military, within the intelligence community, within the State Department, within the American population. It is a very good case in point that the newspaper with the highest circulation in China right now is a compilation of foreign news, including English news, translated into Mandarin and then made publicly available. We have nothing along those lines in the United States. And part of the goal is to understand what Americans are reading, what they're thinking about, what their strengths and weaknesses are. And we need to get to a place, I think, where we are much better educated about the Chinese in this particular case, their strengths, their weaknesses, what they're engaging in and debating, and not just based on English sources, but on Chinese sources as well.
So you wrote the book prior to the recent invasion of Ukraine. So looking at the invasion of Ukraine through the lens of what you learned on the other side of the hill, what do you see the Russians doing differently than what you thought they would do?
Well, I think where the Russians, frankly, were most successful in Ukraine, and this is where it's interesting what Gerasimov, the chief of the Army staff, concluded in multiple comments, statements that he made, as well as writings, was that he argued that the U.S. its most successful cases of overthrowing governments overseas were a limited U.S. military footprint, particularly over the long run. Kind of an occupation, a big push of U.S. forces into a country like Iraq or Afghanistan, 100,000 plus, in perpetuity, which created this aversion from a local population. This is Gerasimov learning, in his view, a lesson from the the U.S. experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and arguing that the U.S.'s most successful cases of regime change were the Libyan examples or the 2001 overthrow of the Taliban regime or the Kosovo campaign, support to the KLA and others, where the U.S. maneuver element in those instances was limited and there was a lot of leveraging of locals. What is striking to me is how much and the Russian playbook early on in Crimea and in Ukraine and even in Syria kept to that similar playbook. Russian air, Russian maritime power, limited Russian ground power, and where there was Russian ground power, it was mostly Spetsnaz, or it was provided training to units that were fighting Syrians, Hezbollah, and others. What they did in Ukraine was to shift significantly in ways that cut against everything that Gerasimov had been talking about over the last decade. They went in with a conventional footprint. It actually was far too small to hold territory. The force-to-population ratio was about 4 Russian soldiers per 1,000 inhabitants, which is way too small to hold any territory. They completely underestimated the Ukrainian willingness to fight, not just the military forces, but also the population willing to stay and fight. They also completely misconstrued how the West was going to respond, and not just in sanctions, but in terms of military assistance to the Ukrainians, which has been critical to targeting Russian tanks, armored personnel carriers, Russian aircraft. The fact that the Ukrainians have been able to shoot them down from the air with Stingers or target them with javelins, target tanks and armored personnel carriers with javelins, has been instrumental, and including the continuing that flow of material. Another mistake, just briefly, was striking when we look at where the Russian positioning was. They pushed no forces into the west of Ukraine, which was a huge problem in their experience in Afghanistan in the 1980s, which was they could not interdict the movement of individuals and weapons coming from Pakistan into Afghanistan, and it was catastrophic for the Russian military. They're in the same position now. It's just worse because there are NATO countries that border Ukraine. So, what's interesting is up until February 2022, the Russian military had actually been pretty cautious in how it had used force, particularly on the ground, the maneuver elements, and the February invasion was a marked shift. It actually makes me wonder how much some of Russia's major military generals that had been writing and commenting were at the forefront of making the decision, or how much of this was really a Vladimir Putin one.
So let's pivot to the Middle East and Iran. You said you'd talk a little bit more about that during our discussion. There's a lot of talk in the news about them getting a nuclear weapon, trying to prevent them. How does that fit into their view of warfare?
Well, I think when we look at the Iranians, what I think is interesting is the Iranians are probably the quintessential irregular power. They attempt to bat well above their weight because they don't have a strong conventional military. In fact, what's interesting is you look at the Russian Army and Air Force, they still have U.S. Shah-era, pre-revolution equipment, Bradleys, fighter aircraft that the United States provided to them. They're weak, and I think they clearly recognize this. If they needed a lesson, it was the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, where they lost large numbers of Iranians to a conventional war against the Iraqi government, Saddam Hussein's government. And so what we've seen with the Iranians is a heavy focus of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Quds Force. It's the paramilitary arm of the IRGC that has focused on not using power directly in the Middle East, but providing assistance to partner forces. So in Lebanon, it's Hezbollah. In Syria, it's a range of mostly Shia militias. In Iraq, it's the Hashd al-Shabi. In Yemen, it's the Houthis. Now in Afghanistan, it's a range of militias, including Hazara and some Uzbek and Tajik and others. And so the issue, I think, from a U.S. standpoint is where the Iranians have posed a problem to us is, again, it's not direct, it's indirectly by providing more sophisticated weapon systems to, say, the Houthis. They have shot land attack cruise missiles at the Saudis or the Emiratis, delta wing drones. They've got ballistic missile capabilities. For once in a while, we'll see the Iranians actually conduct an attack like they did against Abqaiq and Khurais from Iranian soil, but for the most part, it's a threat or to U.S. bases in Iraq from Iraqi militia, including Shia militia. And this is, frankly, the threat to the Israelis as well. It's not a direct Iranian threat. It is indirect through Hezbollah in particular, operating from Lebanon, or Palestinian forces operating from the West Bank or Gaza. Nuclear weapons would be interesting. I think it would actually push this irregular type of warfare more significantly. If the Iranians actually do get a nuclear weapon, I think the likely future trajectory probably looks a little bit like what it does between nuclear-armed Pakistan and India, which is competition is still intense between those countries. It's generally just below the conventional threshold. The Indians will use RAW, Pakistan will use its Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, and they'll fight proxy wars in Afghanistan or in Kashmir or in places like the Baluchistan in Pakistan. So I think in those areas we've seen Pakistan and India fight. That's, I think, the future if the Iranians get nuclear weapons, heavy focus on stuff below that threshold.
So let's pivot now to the Pacific and China. So how does China use its way of warfare to take advantage of the disarray in the world today?
Well, I think China does a couple of things. One is it does continue to build its conventional and nuclear capabilities, and China will continue to build, including fifth generation capabilities, stealth aircraft, for example, aircraft carriers. I mean, at this point, I think the Chinese is still weaker than the U.S. conventionally and the nuclear realm, but it is spending more time and energy building more sophisticated capabilities. But I think what's important to understand the Chinese right now is they also have an important aspect of well, first of all, warfare is not this kind of black or white issue where there is a peacetime where you don't fight, and then where there's warfare, which means conventional operations. I think where the Chinese operate is that competition is constant. It's hourly, and so part of the way they will, I think, continue to attempt to weaken the United States is with a heavy information and disinformation component on what the U.S. is doing. The Chinese have been putting a lot of information out about the domestic polarization in the United States, trying to build a case globally that the U.S. is internally weak, that democracy is under threat and is a defunct ideology. The Chinese, I think, through what you might call soft power, will continue to influence international organizations, World Trade Organizations, World Health Organization, the UN, including the Security Council, will continue to build economic power globally through Belt and Road, not just in the Indo-Pacific, to influence organizations and countries in ways that it tries to build influence. So I think there are a range of aspects. I mean, the Chinese have money, and they will use it economically and technologically. And on the technological side, we've seen the Chinese investing a lot in 5G, machine learning, artificial intelligence. So I think they understand that these will be an important part of warfare in the future.
So you talked about some of the things the United States could do that were maybe non-military. If you were back in the Pentagon, right, and you could wave your wand and do 2 or 3 things to help adjust the defense posture, what would you do?
Well, I think I would do a couple things. One is I think any U.S. broader approach to competition with with countries like China and Russia need to be put under a strategic context. So what is our broader strategy right now? We had a strategy of containment under the Soviet Union. What is that? What does it look like right now? What are we trying to do in the world? And I think, so one thing that I would continue to push is, it's not just talking about China as a pacing threat. It's what is our strategy? What are our objectives? And how are we using U.S. Principles and values as part of that? And I think what it puts me back to is characterizing all of this, for example, in some of the national decision directives of, say, the early Reagan administration years, where they outlined U.S. defense posture in a broader aspect of global containment of not just the Soviet Union, but Soviet ideology. And so it puts defense posture into a broader strategic framework. In addition, I think there's a very important part of this in order to support the defense posture, to nest then what are your broader interagency capabilities. During the Cold War, we had an active measures working group, which was an interagency working group that had an operational and tactical as well as strategic function in combating the Soviet Union. We're still way behind in nesting defense posture into a broader strategic level pathway forward against the Soviets, against the Chinese and the Russians. And then even further down on what does this mean for the Department of Defense, I think what it means is how do we figure out how to increasingly compete in addition to Europe and the Indo-Pacific theaters, how do we continue to compete in other areas of the globe where the Chinese and the Russians are very active, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America. That's going to be a heavy focus on our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, because we don't have a lot of U.S. forces there. Our unmanned capabilities, both air, ground, but also sea-based, for space-based capabilities in areas where we're not going to have a big military posture, but we're going to have adversaries very active in those areas. So those are a couple of things to think about. But I would just go back to nesting. What we don't have is nesting our defense posture in a broader U.S. strategic approach.
So this will be our last question. So what we see in Russia is they're essentially unplugging from the global information highway with censorship and cutting down things, and we've seen the same thing in China. So how does the United States and other countries like the United States break through that in order to provide information to the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and others?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it sort of cuts to the core of this as being a competition of ideology. During the Cold War, and again, the situation today is very different, but we used Radio Free Europe to beam into foreign countries in the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. We used the Voice of America to do that, including getting around jamming. I think part of what we're talking about is a lot of U.S. focus on VPNs, for example, or encrypted technology, so that individuals within those countries can get access to information other than that which is coming from the Russian government or from the Chinese government. And I think what's important here is to see, as the Russian government is cracking down on access to information, Proton email went up 1,000% in because it's got encrypted capabilities in about a 2-week span. So if we can continue to provide those capabilities so that Russians or Chinese or Iranians can get access not just to our information, but to information that's more than just state-run, I think it has a similar purpose. I think at the end of the day, what the U.S. has and its democratic allies, democracy and freedom and capitalism and ensuring access to information and freedom of religion, is what most people around the world are going to gravitate. That's how we won this last Cold War. I think that's how we'll do it again in the future.
Well, thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Today we've had the honor of talking to Dr. Jones about his book, 3 Dangerous Men. General Swan, I turn it over to you.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion about a very complex world that we're facing these days and bringing us up to speed. So thank you, gentlemen, both of you. Before we depart, I want to bring you up to speed on some upcoming AUSA events. On the 5th of April, we will host another noon report like this one on the Army's integrated prevention system with Dr. James Hellis, the director of the Army Resilience Directorate. On the 13th of April, we'll host a full-day in-person AUSA Hot Topic Symposium on Army Installation Partnership for Mission Assurance. That one will be sponsored by our friends at Leidos. And on the 20th of April, we'll have yet another noon report on the U.S. Army's Central Command, RCENT, with the Commanding General, Lieutenant General Ron Clark. These are just a few of the many events, programs, and speakers we have coming up at AUSA, and we hope you can join us for one or more of those events. For more information on any of these events or to register, go to the AUSA website at ausa.org. And finally, we want to thank everyone for your membership in AUSA. Membership matters. Frankly, we cannot bring you these programs or advocate for America's Army on Capitol Hill without your membership. So gentlemen, once again, thank you for a great conversation, and to everyone out there, have a great Army Day.